Step away from the bike, ma'am, right now. Those 6 words spoken in front of 40 witnesses were the ones that would unravel Officer Ryan Caldwell's entire career. Because the woman he was pointing at wasn't a thief. She was a grandmother who had just walked out of the hospital after open-heart surgery. And the motorcycle he was threatening to confiscate, it was the last piece of her dead husband she had left in this world. Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far Margaret's story travels. Now let's go back to where this all began. Margaret Whitmore had been awake since 4 in the morning. Not because of the pain, though. The pain was real, a deep surgical ache that ran from her sternum to her ribs every time she drew a full breath. 3 days earlier, she had been lying on an operating table at Billings General Hospital while a cardiac surgeon repaired what years of hard living and harder grief had slowly broken inside her chest. The doctors had told her to rest for at least 2 weeks. Her daughter-in-law had set up the guest bedroom with extra pillows and a call button and a little handwritten sign on the nightstand that said, "Don't you dare get up without telling someone first, Mom." Margaret had read that sign. She had smiled at it. And then at 4:17 in the morning, she had gotten dressed as quietly as she could, folded the note, placed it gently back on the nightstand, and walked out the front door. Because Margaret Whitmore had made a promise to her husband, and she had never broken a promise to Thomas in 42 years of marriage. She wasn't about to start now. The drive from Billings to Red Valley took just under an hour on Route 12, and Margaret made it in 53 minutes because the roads were empty and the early sky was the kind of dark blue that only happens just before the world wakes up. She drove her son's old pickup. Caleb had left the keys hanging by the door, which meant he trusted her more than the doctors did, and she kept the radio off the whole way. She needed the quiet. She needed to think about Thomas. Thomas Whitmore had been a big man with rough hands and a laugh that arrived before he did in any room. He had spent 30 years as a motorcycle mechanic in Red Valley, and in all that time, he never once put a price on his work that a person couldn't afford. If you were broke, he worked for free. If you were struggling, he found a way to make the bill disappear. People in that town still talked about Thomas the way you talk about someone who changed your life without ever trying to take credit for it. I had died 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days ago. Margaret had counted every single one of those days. The Harley had been his last project, an old 1978 Harley-Davidson shovelhead that he'd found at a salvage auction and dragged home in pieces on a borrowed flatbed trailer. He'd been working on it for 6 years before the first heart attack slowed him down. Then the second one finished the job. After the funeral, the bike had sat in Caleb's garage like a wound that hadn't healed. And then one day about 8 months ago, Caleb had walked into that garage, picked up a wrench, and started working. He didn't say anything about it to Margaret. He didn't make any announcements. He just started showing up at the garage every evening after chapter business was done, and he kept showing up until the bike ran. 2 weeks ago, he had called her. "Mom, it's done. Dad's bike is done." Margaret had held the phone against her chest for a full 30 seconds before she could respond, but she hadn't gone to see it. The surgery had been scheduled, and then the recovery, and then the careful waiting, and all along she'd been carrying this one idea like a small, warm coal inside her chest. She was going to surprise him. She was going to show up at Red Valley Custom Garage, where Caleb had taken the bike for a final paint detail, and she was going to pick it up herself. She was going to ride home in her son's old pickup with that Harley trailing on the flatbed behind her, and she was going to pull into the driveway, and she was going to watch her son's face when he saw it. That was the plan. That was the promise. Red Valley Custom Garage opened at 7:30, and Margaret was waiting in the parking lot when Jimmy Rourke, the owner, pulled in at 7:22. Jimmy took one look at her through his windshield and immediately got out of his truck with the expression of a man who knew he was outmatched. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully, "does Caleb know you're here?" "Caleb thinks I'm resting," she said. Jimmy looked at the bags under her eyes and the careful way she was holding her left side when she breathed. "Are you supposed to be resting?" "I'm supposed to be doing a lot of things," Margaret said. "Are you going to let me see the bike or not?" Jimmy let her see the bike. Oh, it was more beautiful than she had imagined. Thomas had always talked about what it would look like when it was finished, the deep burgundy paint. The chrome engine catches the wide handlebars he preferred because of the way they sat when you cruised. He described it so many times over the years that Margaret had built a picture of it in her mind. The reality was better. Caleb had gotten every detail right. The burgundy was deep and rich, almost wine-colored in the shop lighting. The chrome was polished to a mirror. On the left panel, just below the gas cap, Caleb had added one small detail that hadn't been part of the original plan, a small engraving barely larger than a thumbnail of a set of wings. Because Thomas Whitmore had served 2 tours in Vietnam before he ever touched a wrench. Margaret reached out and touched the wings with 2 fingers. She didn't cry. She was past the point where crying was the right word for what happened to her when she thought about Thomas. It was something quieter than crying and something deeper. It was the particular grief of a person who has loved someone so completely that losing them doesn't diminish the love. It just changes where the love has to live. He would have loved it, she said quietly. Jimmy Rourke, a man who had once been arrested twice for bar fights and currently had a tattoo of a cobra on his neck, had to pretend to be very busy with a clipboard for about 30 seconds. Yes, ma'am, he said finally. He really would have. Margaret spent almost 2 hours at the garage that morning. She filled out the paperwork. Jimmy walked her through everything: the registration, which was titled in Caleb's name, with Margaret listed as the co-owner, by Caleb's own instruction, the insurance card, the title transfer documents. He tucked everything into a manila envelope and put the envelope in the saddlebag. Then Margaret did the thing she had been planning for 6 days. She opened the small inner pocket of her coat and took out a photograph. It was the photograph, the one she had carried for 42 years through every house and every hardship and every dark night, when she wasn't sure how much more she had left in her. It was a picture of Thomas at 26 years old, standing beside his first motorcycle, grinning like the world was a gift someone had just handed him for free. She folded it carefully in a piece of flannel cloth. She placed it inside the saddlebag beside the registration envelope, and she closed the latch. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay, Thomas, let's go home." Jimmy helped her load the Harley onto Caleb's flatbed trailer and secure the tie-downs. He offered twice to drive her himself. She declined twice with the particular firmness that lets a person know the conversation is finished. She pulled out of the garage at 9:40 in the morning. She made it exactly 4 blocks before she needed to stop. The tie-down on the left side had come slightly loose on the first turn, and she wasn't about to risk Thomas's bike getting damaged on a pothole. She pulled into the parking lot of a hardware store on 5th Street, got out, carefully walked around to the trailer, and began retightening the strap. This was when Linda Parker saw her. Linda Parker had lived 3 houses down from the Whitmore family for 19 years. In those 19 years, she and Margaret had developed the kind of carefully maintained distance that exists between 2 people who fundamentally disagree on how the world should work and have made a mutual unspoken agreement to avoid discussing it. The thing Linda had never been able to tolerate, not in 19 years, not for a single day, was the motorcycles. The noise, the people, the leather and the flags, and the rumbling engines at all hours of the evening when the chapter rode through. The way Thomas Whitmore had always waved at everyone like Red Valley belonged to everyone equally, and the way his son Caleb had grown up to be president of the local chapter, and the way Margaret had always looked at all of it like it was something to be proud of. Linda Parker did not think it was something to be proud of. She thought it was something to be afraid of. And when she saw an old woman in a worn jacket standing beside an expensive-looking motorcycle in that parking lot, her brain did what brains do when they are already primed by years of suspicion. It skipped the part where it asked questions. It went straight to the part where it decided. Linda Parker walked back to her car, picked up her phone, and dialed 911. "Yes, I'd like to report a theft," she said. "There's an elderly woman in the 5th Street hardware store parking lot, and she's trying to take a very expensive motorcycle. The bike has been sitting in front of that store for days. I don't think it belongs to her." The dispatcher asked if she was sure. "I'm absolutely sure," Linda said. She was absolutely wrong. Officer Ryan Caldwell was 26 years old and had been on the force in Red Valley for 14 months. And he was the kind of young officer who worked hard and studied the procedures and genuinely believed in what he was doing, but who had also developed somewhere in those 14 months a habit of deciding things quickly. He'd grown up watching police procedural shows where instinct was celebrated as a superpower, and somewhere in the translation from television to real life, he had confused instinct with assumption. He arrived at the 5th Street parking lot at 9:57 in the morning. He saw an elderly woman standing beside a Harley-Davidson motorcycle that was loaded on a trailer. He saw the worn jacket and the careful way she was moving like someone in physical discomfort. He saw the motorcycle, which he recognized immediately as a restored shovelhead, worth somewhere between $18,000 and $25,000. And in the space of about 4 seconds before he had spoken a single word to her, he had already formed a conclusion. He stepped out of his patrol car and walked toward her. "Ma'am," he said, "can I ask what you're doing with that motorcycle?" Margaret looked up. She had the saddlebag open because she'd been checking that the registration envelope was still secure after the tie-down had shifted. "It's my son's motorcycle," she said. "I'm just tightening the straps. One of the tie-downs came loose." "Your son's motorcycle," Caldwell repeated. "That's right. Can you tell me your son's name?" "Caleb Whitmore." Something flickered across Caldwell's face, not recognition exactly, but something, a wariness. He looked at the bike again, then back at her. "Do you have any documentation for the vehicle?" "Right here," Margaret said, and she reached into the saddlebag. "Stop." His hand went to his radio. "Ma'am, don't reach into that bag." Margaret stopped. She looked at him steadily. "Officer, the registration is right there in the bag. I put it there myself 30 minutes ago. If you let me. Step away from the motorcycle, please." Margaret straightened up slowly. The movement cost her. She felt the pull of the surgical site, and her breath came a little faster for a moment, and she had to press her hand against her side. "Officer," she said, "I just had open heart surgery 3 days ago. I need you to understand that I'm not—" "Step away from the motorcycle, ma'am." He said it louder the second time. Not because she hadn't heard him the first time, because someone was watching from across the street, and he wanted them to see that he was in control. By 10:05, there were 11 people watching. By 10:15, there were closer to 40. People had come out of the hardware store. A man from the coffee shop across the street had wandered over. A woman pushing a stroller had stopped on the sidewalk. 3 people already had their phones raised. Margaret stood beside the truck, 5 feet from the trailer, her hands clasped in front of her because she hadn't been told to put them behind her back yet, and she was determined to give this young man no reason to escalate. She had lived 68 years in this world. She knew what this was. She had seen it before, not in a parking lot, but in hospitals where nurses talked past her like she wasn't there, in grocery stores where managers appeared out of nowhere when she lingered too long, in offices where the person behind the desk smiled and said, "Yes, of course," and then found 14 reasons to say no. She knew what it felt like to be assessed and found wanting before you'd open your mouth. She was not panicking. She was not crying. She was doing what she had always done, standing still, staying calm, and waiting for the moment when the truth would find enough room to get through. Officer Caldwell had spent the last 7 minutes on his radio. He'd run a check on the motorcycle's plate. The registration came back to Caleb Whitmore. He did not stop. He walked back to Margaret and said, "The registered owner is listed as Caleb Whitmore. You said that's your son?" "Yes. He's the president of the local Hells Angels chapter." "He is." Caldwell looked at the motorcycle, then at her. "How do I know he authorized you to take this vehicle?" "Because," Margaret said very carefully, "I am co-listed on the registration, which is in the saddlebag, which I asked to show you 11 minutes ago." Caldwell stared at her. A man in the crowd, later identified as David Soren, 44, a contractor who had known Thomas Whitmore for 15 years, called out from 20 feet away, "Officer, that's Margaret Whitmore. She lives on Calhoun Street. That's Thomas Whitmore's bike. Everybody in this town knows that bike." Caldwell turned and looked at the man. "Sir, I need you to stay back." "I'm just telling you." "Sir," the word landed like a door closing. "Stay back or I will ask you to leave the area." David Soren stayed where he was. His jaw tightened, but he stayed. Margaret watched the crowd. She watched their faces. Most of them were uncertain, the particular uncertainty of people who want to help, but are afraid of what helping might cost them. She understood that too. She didn't blame them for it. The moment that changed everything happened at 10:23. Caldwell walked to the saddlebag without asking Margaret's permission and unlatched it. "You can't," Margaret started. "I have reasonable suspicion to—" "You have a registration envelope right in front of your face," she said. For the first time, her voice cracked, not from fear, from something closer to grief, the exhaustion of a woman who has survived everything the world has thrown at her and is now standing in a parking lot being treated like a criminal because a young man with a badge made up his mind before she could say a word. Caldwell reached into the saddlebag. He pulled out the manila envelope, the registration, the title, the insurance card, every single document that proved without question that the motorcycle belonged exactly to whom Margaret said it did. He set the envelope aside on the trailer rail without opening it, and then he reached deeper into the saddlebag and pulled out the flannel cloth. Margaret's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "Please don't." He unwrapped it. The photograph fell. It didn't land gracefully. It hit the edge of the trailer and slid off and landed face down on the asphalt, and the glass in the small frame cracked in a line across the lower corner, right across Thomas Whitmore's boots. The crowd went quiet. Even the phones went still for a moment. Margaret did not move. She looked at the photograph on the ground and she did not move. "What is this?" Caldwell asked, holding up the flannel cloth. "That," Margaret said, and her voice was the quietest it had been all morning, "is none of your business." Caldwell looked at the photograph on the ground. Something moved behind his eyes, something that might have been recognition or discomfort or the very first edge of doubt. But he was 26 years old, and he had already committed to this, and he was standing in front of 40 witnesses, and he did not know how to back down without looking like he had been wrong from the beginning. Because he had been wrong from the beginning, and he couldn't admit it, so he kept going. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your back." The sound that went through the crowd when Caldwell said those words was not a gasp. It was something more complicated than a gasp. It was the sound of people who had been uncertain, suddenly becoming certain. Certain that something wrong was happening, certain that they were watching it, and certain that most of them were going to let it happen anyway. Because that is what people do when they are afraid and confused, and the person with the authority is the one doing the wrong thing. A young woman named Kayla. She was 22, home from college. For the summer had been walking her dog, said very loudly from the edge of the crowd. "She's a grandmother who just had surgery. You are putting handcuffs on a grandmother who just had heart surgery." Caldwell looked at her. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." "This concerns everybody watching," Kayla said, and she held up her phone higher. "This is being recorded." "That's your right," Caldwell said. And then he clicked the handcuffs onto Margaret's wrist. The first cuff went on wrong, too tight, because his hands weren't steady anymore, because somewhere below the authority and the procedure and the momentum, he'd built himself into something in his body understood what his brain still refused to process. Margaret made a sound, not a scream, not a creak, a small, sharp intake of breath, because her wrists were thin and the surgery was 3 days ago, and the cuffs pressed against a bruiser from an IV line, and it hurt in the way that small, specific pain hurts when your body is already at its limit. David Soren stepped forward. "Hey," his voice was different now, lower. "Hey, you need to stop. She has a medical condition. This is wrong. What you're doing right now is wrong." "Sir, I'm going to need you to—" "I don't care what you need me to do," David said. "I'm telling you, this woman has a heart condition and she just had surgery and you are hurting her. That registration is right there. Open the envelope." "Sir, open the envelope." Caldwell looked at the crowd. He counted the phones. He looked at the envelope sitting on the trailer rail. He looked at Margaret, who was standing very straight, her hands behind her back, her eyes closed, breathing through whatever the pain was doing to her. And he did not open the envelope. At 10:29, Margaret's knees buckled slightly. It wasn't a fall. It was the particular sway of a body reaching the edge of what it can sustain like a tree in wind before the real storm hits. She caught herself. She straightened, but the crowd saw it. "She's going to collapse," a woman said sharply from the back. "Somebody call an ambulance," another voice said. "She needs to sit down," said a third. Caldwell looked at Margaret, and something finally cracked through the wall he'd built around himself in the last 30 minutes. "Ma'am, are you—" "I'm fine," she said. She opened her eyes. She looked directly at him. "I have been fine for 68 years. Open the envelope, officer. Everything you need to know is in that envelope. I am asking you very calmly to open the envelope and do what you should have done 25 minutes ago." Caldwell reached for the envelope. His radio crackled. A voice said his name and said there were reports of a large group of motorcycles on Route 12 heading toward Red Valley. Caldwell stopped reaching for the envelope. He keyed his radio. "How many?" he asked. There was a pause. The voice on the other end of the radio sounded like a person who was looking at something they hadn't been prepared to see. "A lot," the voice said. "Officer Caldwell, there are a lot of motorcycles." 12 miles away on Route 12, Caleb Whitmore was riding his personal bike at the front of a column that stretched back so far he couldn't see the end of it in his mirrors. He had received the text at 10:07, 4 words, "Mom needs you now." The text was from Jason Miller, 23 years old, a delivery driver who had been parked outside the hardware store eating a breakfast sandwich when the patrol car had rolled in. Jason had recognized Margaret immediately. He'd grown up 2 streets over from the Whitmore house, and Margaret had been the woman who left cookies on the porch for the neighborhood kids at Christmas. He had watched for 3 minutes. He had waited to see if someone else would do something. When no one did, he had sent that text. Caleb had read the text once. He had not called his mother. He had not asked for clarification. He had not taken a moment to assess the situation. He had raised his right hand in the air, and 273 people had turned their engines on. He had raised his hand a second time, and they had started moving. By the time the column reached the edge of Red Valley city limits, other chapters had heard what was happening. The nearest chapter had turned out immediately joined at the county road junction by members who had been called by text and by phone and by the particular rapid spread of information that happens in a community where everyone knows everyone, and the message is someone hurt one of ours. 500 motorcycles, not a threat, a family. In the parking lot on 5th Street, the sound arrived before the sight. It started as a low-frequency something you felt more than heard, a vibration in the air that made the loose change in people's pockets rattle and the coffee and paper cups tremble. And then it got louder and louder, and the crowd in the parking lot turned almost as one toward the street, and the motorcycles came. Not fast, not aggressive. They moved in formation, deliberate and slow, filling the road in a column that seemed to have no end. And when the front riders reached 5th Street and turned and began filing into the parking lot and the street around it, people on the sidewalk stepped back automatically. Not from fear exactly, but from the sheer presence of the thing. Margaret heard the engines. She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on Officer Caldwell, and she watched his face change. Not all at once, in pieces, like a wall with water coming through it, first one crack, then another, then the whole structure becoming suddenly and obviously unsustainable. He had gone pale. His hand was on his radio, but he wasn't keying it. He was looking past Margaret at the column of motorcycles and calculating something, and whatever he was calculating, the answer was clearly not reassuring. The engines cut one by one in a wave from the entrance inward. The silence that followed was enormous. 500 people on motorcycles, and not one of them spoke. The only sound was the slight wind, and distantly one of the phones in the crowd playing its own footage back on the screen. Caleb Whitmore dismounted. I was a large man, 6'3", wide in the shoulder, with hands like his father's and his father's eyes, which were the kind of dark brown that can look either warm or very serious, depending on what they are looking at. Right now they were looking at his mother's hands behind her back, and at the cracked photograph on the ground, and at the envelope sitting unopened on the trailer rail. He walked across the parking lot. The crowd parted, not because they were afraid, because they recognized that something was happening that had its own gravity, its own course, and the right thing to do was simply to step aside and bear witness to it. He reached his mother. He stood in front of her. He looked at her for a long moment, at the careful way she was holding herself, at the bruise visible on her left wrist above the cuff, at the steadiness in her eyes that had never once failed in all the years he had known her. "Hi, baby," Margaret said. And Caleb Whitmore, president of the Red Valley Hells Angels chapter, a man who had stood in rooms full of people who wanted to intimidate him without ever once looking away, pressed his eyes shut for exactly 2 seconds. Then he turned to Officer Ryan Caldwell. "Why," he said quietly, "did you decide my mother was guilty before you looked at the evidence?" Caldwell opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "The registration is in that envelope," Caleb said. "It has been in that envelope the whole time she was standing here. My mother asked you 11 times to open it. I am asking you now in front of all these people to open it." Caldwell looked at the envelope. His hand moved slowly. He picked it up. He opened it. He read the registration. The name on the document was clear: Caleb Thomas Whitmore and Margaret Ann Whitmore, co-owner. The silence in the parking lot was the loudest thing any of them had ever heard. Caldwell set the document back down. He reached for the handcuff key. His hands were shaking. He removed the cuffs from Margaret's wrists without a word. And in that moment, in that specific, devastating witness silence, something shifted in Red Valley, Montana that would not shift back. Not that day, not that year, not ever. Margaret bent down slowly and picked up Thomas's photograph from the asphalt. She turned it over. She looked at the cracked glass, the diagonal line running across her husband's boots, across the young man grinning like the world was a gift. She held the photograph against her chest. She did not look at Caldwell. She looked at her son. "Take me home," she said. And behind them, 500 engines waited in perfect silence. Caleb drove her home himself. He put one of his guys on the truck with the trailer, gave 3 words of instruction, "Careful with it," and then walked his mother to his own bike, the big touring model he rode when he needed comfort over speed. He didn't ask if she was okay. He already knew the answer, and he also knew his mother well enough to understand that asking the question out loud would only make her feel like she had to perform a version of fine for his benefit. So he didn't ask. He just helped her onto the passenger seat the way he had watched his father do 1,000 times over the years. One hand steady at her elbow, the other firm at her back, never rushing, never making her feel fragile, even when she clearly was. "You know you weren't supposed to leave the house this morning," he said when the engine was running and the crowd was behind them. "I know," she said. "The doctor said 2 weeks. The doctors don't know everything." He looked at her in the mirror. He could see her face in it, that particular composed expression she'd worn his entire life. The one that meant, "I have made my decision and I am at peace with it, and you may have opinions, but they will not change anything." He shook his head slowly. "You are exactly like him," he said. She put her hand on his shoulder lightly, the way she used to when he was a boy, and he was upset about something, and she wanted him to know she was there without turning it into a discussion. "I know," she said again, and they rode home. Behind them, the column of motorcycles moved out of the parking lot in a slow-ordered progression, the way a river settles after something has disturbed it, not calm exactly, but purposeful. Directed, moving towards something rather than away from it. The something they were moving toward would take several more months to fully arrive. But it had started. In a parking lot on 5th Street with a photograph on the ground and an envelope nobody opened for 25 minutes, it had absolutely irreversibly started. Back in that parking lot, Officer Ryan Caldwell was still standing beside his patrol car. He had not moved since Caleb rode away. Around him, people were dispersing slowly, but not the way crowds usually disperse after something ends. They were dispersing the way people disperse when something has happened that they are not finished processing, when they know they will be thinking about it for a long time, and they need to go somewhere private to do that thinking. A few of them looked at Caldwell as they passed. None of them said anything. They didn't need to. Caldwell picked up the envelope from where it had been left on the trailer rail. He looked at the registration again, though he had already read it and already understood it and already known from the moment he opened it exactly how completely wrong he had been. He set it back down. He stood there alone in an empty parking lot with the crease of the handcuff key still in his palm and the memory of that small, sharp sound Margaret had made, and he began to understand something about himself that he was not going to be able to unknow. He had been so sure. He had been so absolutely, completely professionally sure. And he had been wrong about every single thing. He got into his patrol car and sat there for a long time before he started the engine. What he didn't know yet, what none of them knew yet, was that the parking lot was not the end of anything. It was the precise and specific beginning. Because Jason Miller, 23 years old, delivery driver, childhood neighbor of the Whitmore family, had been recording from the moment he sent that text. He hadn't lowered his phone once. Not when the crowd gathered. Not when the cuffs went on. Not when the photograph fell. Not when the engines arrived. Not when Caleb walked across the parking lot. Not when Caldwell opened the envelope and his face did what it did. Jason had the whole thing, 12 minutes and 44 seconds of unbroken footage, and he had no idea what to do with it. He sat in his delivery van in the hardware store parking lot for about 8 minutes after everyone else had gone, eating the last cold bite of his breakfast sandwich and watching the video play back on his phone. He watched Caldwell say, "Step away from the bike." He watched the documents being ignored. He watched the photograph fall. He watched the cuffs go on. He watched Margaret's knees buckle and then steady. He watched Caleb walk across the parking lot. He watched the envelope being opened. He watched Caldwell's face. Then he watched the whole thing again. Then he called his older sister, Renee, who worked in digital marketing and had once gotten a local story picked up by the regional news when she shared it strategically to the right people. Renee, he said when she picked up, I have a video and I don't know exactly what I'm doing, but I think a lot of people need to see it. Renee said, send it to me right now. He sent it. 22 seconds later, she called back. Jason, she said, and her voice had the careful steadiness of someone who is trying not to alarm a person they love, while also conveying the urgency of a situation that is genuinely urgent. I need you to understand that this video is going to be seen by a very large number of people. How large? I don't know, but large. Are you okay with that? Jason thought about Margaret's face when the photograph hit the ground. He thought about the sound she had made when the cuff went on wrong. He thought about 40 people standing in a parking lot watching something wrong happen, and most of them staying quiet because being quiet felt safer than speaking. Yes, he said, I'm okay with that. Renee posted it at 11:14 in the morning. By noon, it had been viewed 40,000 times. By 2 in the afternoon, it had been shared to 3 national news aggregator accounts. In the comments sections, we're already doing what comment sections do, fracturing into argument, into outrage, into the complicated, loud chorus of people who have opinions about things they did not witness firsthand. But underneath all of it, one thing was consistent. Thousands of people watching that video were watching the moment the photograph fell, and thousands of people were watching Margaret's face when it did. And whatever their opinions were about police and bikers and old women in parking lots and small Montana towns, almost all of them agreed on one thing. That moment was not right. What happened to Margaret Whitmore in that parking lot was not right, and somebody needed to say so. That afternoon at 12:40, Margaret's phone started ringing. She was lying on the couch in Caleb's living room with a blanket over her and an ice pack on her left wrist where the cuff had pressed too hard against the bruise. The television was off, the house was quiet. 3 of Caleb's people were outside, not crowding the space, just present the way they had always been around the Whitmore house. When something was wrong, steady and reliable in the way that community is when it is functioning the way community should. Her phone rang with an unfamiliar number, and she almost didn't answer. She answered. Mrs. Whitmore. The voice was professional, female, slightly breathless, in a way that suggested the woman on the other end had been doing something fast-paced, and this call was an interruption from it. My name is Sandra Leach. I'm a producer with the regional affiliate for KRTV. We're covering a story that we believe involves you, and I was hoping. How did you get this number? Margaret asked. A brief pause. It was provided to us by someone at your mechanic's garage. Jimmy, Margaret thought. She was going to have a conversation with Jimmy. I don't think I'm interested, Margaret said. Mrs. Whitmore, a video of what happened to you this morning has been viewed by several 100,000 people in the last. I know what happened this morning, Margaret said. I was there. Another pause, longer this time. Sandra Leach recalibrated. Mrs. Whitmore, she said. And this time the professional brightness in her voice had dropped away, leaving something a little more honest underneath. What happened to you was wrong, and a lot of people know it was wrong because they watched it happen. But right now, the only story most of them have is 12 minutes of parking lot footage. They don't know who you are. They don't know anything about you or your husband or your family. And in the absence of that story, people are going to fill in the blanks themselves, and some of them are going to fill them in wrong. I'm not asking you to perform something or be brave for television. I'm asking if you want the chance to tell your own story in your own words. Margaret was quiet for a long time. From outside, she could hear the low murmur of conversation, the sound of boots on the porch steps, the particular familiar atmosphere of the Hells Angels chapter present in full because one of their own was hurting, and that was simply what you did. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the way he had always said the truth doesn't need embellishment, Maggie. It just needs room to breathe. Not today, she said finally. I had open heart surgery 3 days ago and I need to sleep, but call me tomorrow at 9 in the morning and we'll talk. She hung up. Caleb appeared in the doorway. Who was that television? Margaret said. He leaned against the doorframe. What did you tell them? I told them to call back tomorrow. He was quiet for a moment, then, Mom, you don't have to do any of this. I can have my lawyer. I know you can, she said, but that's not what I want. What do you want? She adjusted the ice pack on her wrist. She looked at the ceiling. I want people to understand that what happened to me today happens to people who don't have 500 motorcycles coming when they call, she said. That's what I want. Caleb said nothing. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the couch the way he had when he was small, and the world was confusing and she was the person whose presence made it less confusing. They sat together without speaking for a while. The ice pack grew warm. Outside, the engines were quiet. Thomas's Harley was in the garage, finally home, and the video kept spreading. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the number was past 2 million. The police department's public information officer had already issued one statement that managed to say very little in a considerable number of words. Something about an ongoing internal review and commitment to community standards, and the department takes all concerns seriously. And that statement had been shared approximately 4,000 times, most of those shares accompanied by the kind of commentary that made it clear the public was not satisfied with it. The department's internal phone lines had been ringing since noon. The chief of police, a man named Gerald Howell, who had spent 22 years building a department that functioned on the relationship between the community and the badge, sat in his office at 4 in the afternoon and watched the video 3 times. After the third viewing, he called his deputy chief into the office. "Tell me about Caldwell," he said. The deputy chief, Marcus Webb, 15 years on the force, deeply practical, the kind of administrator who kept meticulous notes precisely for moments like this one, placed a file on the desk. 14 months on the force, Webb said. No formal complaints filed. 2 informal verbal complaints about his manner during traffic stops, both noted, neither escalated. 2 commendations, good paperwork, responsive to calls, ambitious. Howell looked at the file without opening it. Did he receive the community engagement training we ran in March? Webb was quiet for a moment in a way that answered the question. He was on leave during the March session, Webb said. He hadn't been rescheduled yet. Howell looked at his deputy. "Get me a meeting with the union rep and legal counsel first thing tomorrow morning," he said. "And call the mayor's office and let them know we're going to be in front of this, not behind it." "Yes, sir." "And Marcus." Howell leaned back in his chair. The weight of the day was visible in him, the way weight is visible in people who take responsibility seriously, not dramatic. Just present, settled into the posture and the set of the jaw. "Get me Margaret Whitmore's contact information. I want to reach out personally, not through a statement, not through legal, me personally to her." Webb wrote it down. "Do you want me to review what to say?" "No," Howell said. "What I need to say doesn't need preparation. It just needs to be said." He was right about that. He was also right that he should have moved faster. Because the thing he didn't yet know, the thing that was developing in a server room across the city where the county records were stored, and a journalist named Patricia Osei had been working since 2 in the afternoon, was that the parking lot incident was not the first time Ryan Caldwell had made a fast judgment and refused to reconsider it. Patricia Osei was 31 years old and worked for the Billings Gazette. She had grown up in Red Valley, which meant she had sources in this town that no outside journalist could touch, and she had been on the phone since the video started circulating with every one of those sources. What they were telling her was not comfortable. The first call had come from a man named Robert Ashford, 63, a retired postal worker who lived on the east side. Robert told her about a traffic stop 6 months ago. Caldwell, a young black man visiting his aunt, a search of the vehicle that lasted 45 minutes based on what Caldwell had described in his report as visible nervousness. Nothing found, no charges filed, no formal complaint because the young man had been so shaken by the experience that he just wanted to get in his car and drive away. The second call had come from Maria Gutierrez, 47, who ran a laundry service. 3 months ago, a misunderstanding about a van parked outside a business. Caldwell, the same pattern assumption, first evidence, second retreat without acknowledgement of the error. Neither of these people had filed formal complaints. Both of them said the same thing when Patricia asked why. What was the point? Who would have listened? Patricia wrote down everything they said. She wrote down the timeline of the parking lot incident in meticulous detail, cross-referencing the video timestamps with the call log she'd obtained from the dispatch records. And then she wrote a headline. She didn't publish it yet. She called her editor first. "I have the Whitmore story," she said, "but it's bigger than the parking lot." Her editor said, "How much bigger?" Pattern of behavior going back at least 6 months. 2 additional incidents with similar characteristics. Targets who didn't have the resources or the platform to be heard. There was a silence on the other end. "How solid is it?" "Solid enough," Patricia said. "I need 1 more day to nail the last piece." You've got until tomorrow at bite, her editor said. And Patricia, be thorough. This is going to make noise. It's already making noise, she said. I'm just trying to make sure the right things get heard in it. She hung up and went back to her notes. Meanwhile, in the Red Valley Police Department, Ryan Caldwell was sitting in a conference room with his union representative and two department supervisors, and he was going through what had happened step by step, the way you do in an internal review, except that the step-by-step was not going the way he had hoped. Because when you have to explain each decision in sequence, the initial approach, the dismissal of the registration, offer the refusal to listen to witnesses, the search of the saddlebag, the photograph of the cuffs, when you have to explain each one in order, the cumulative picture becomes impossible to argue with. His union representative, a careful man named Phil, had listened to the sequence without interrupting. When Caldwell finished, Phil said very quietly, "Ryan, did you open the envelope?" "I not immediately, no." "Did you look at the documents she offered?" "I had concerns about the situation, Ryan." Phil's voice was not unkind, but it was not soft either. "Did you open the envelope?" Caldwell looked at the table. "No," he said, "not right away." Phil made a note. The supervisors made notes. The room was quiet in a specific way that experienced officers recognize as the quiet that comes just before something changes and cannot be changed back. Caldwell looked up. "I made a judgment call," he said. "Officers make judgment calls." "That's true," one of the supervisors said, "but judgment calls are supposed to incorporate available evidence. The available evidence was in an envelope on the trailer rail for 25 minutes and you didn't open it." "I was managing a dynamic situation." "You were managing a 68-year-old woman recovering from open-heart surgery who offered you documentation 11 times. Caldwell had no answer for that, because there was no answer for that. There was only the fact of it, the plain documented, witness-recorded, undeniable fact that he had looked at Margaret Whitmore and decided what she was before she had opened her mouth, and nothing she had said or offered or provided in the following 32 minutes had been enough to make him reconsider that decision. And that was not a judgment call. That was something else, something with a name he was not ready to say out loud yet. But that name was in the room with them, as present and unmovable as the table between them, and all four people in that conference room knew it. Phil closed his notepad. "I'm going to advise you not to make any public statements," he said to Caldwell. "Not to the press, not on social media, not to coworkers. The department is conducting a formal review. Until that review is complete, you will say nothing." Caldwell nodded. He drove home in his personal vehicle that evening. The patrol car stayed in the lot. He did not know yet whether it would be waiting for him when the review was done. That uncertainty was the first real consequence he had experienced all day. It would not be the last. Margaret slept for 11 hours. She woke up the next morning at 7:14 with the kind of deep settled ache that comes after a body has finally been allowed to rest after it has been pushed too far. She lay still for a moment, cataloging the damage. The wrist was bruised dark purple along the inside where the cuff had been. The surgical site was sore in a way her cardiologist was going to express opinions about, and her feet were swollen from standing too long on concrete. None of it was serious. All of it hurt. She sat up, slowly went to the window and looked out at the driveway. 3 bikes were still parked outside. They had been there all night. She didn't need to ask why. She had watched these people for 30 years, had learned their rhythms, their loyalties, the particular language of their presence, and she knew that 3 bikes in the driveway overnight meant we are here and you are not alone, and nothing more complicated than that. She went to the kitchen and made coffee. Caleb appeared 10 minutes later with the look of a man who had not slept much and was running on the particular fuel of controlled anger and black coffee. "Patricia O.C. called," he said. Margaret poured herself a cup. "Went 7 this morning. She's working a piece for the Gazette. She says it's not just about yesterday." Margaret looked at him. "She found 2 other people," Caleb said. 2 other incidents. Similar situations. Same officer, nobody filed a complaint because..." He stopped, pressed his mouth flat, tried again. "Because they thought no one would listen." Margaret wrapped both hands around her mug. "And will someone listen now?" she asked. Caleb looked at her. "The whole country is watching, Mom." She thought about that. She thought about the weight of being seen, the specific responsibility of it, because visibility was not the same as justice. Visibility was just the beginning of the conversation. The conversation still had to go somewhere. Real had to end somewhere that mattered for the people who would come after the people. Nobody was watching the Robert Ashfords and Maria Gutierrez's, who would be standing alone in parking lots with no video and no 500 motorcycles and no cameras trained on their faces. "I'm calling Sandra Leach back at 9, she said. "And then I'll talk to Patricia." "You don't have to do either of those things," Caleb said. "I know I don't have to," Margaret said. "But those other people, the ones who thought nobody would listen, they deserve to have their stories told too. And I'm the one who happens to be standing where people can hear me right now." Caleb was quiet. He refilled his coffee. He sat down across from her. "There's something else," he said. His tone shifted slightly, became more careful. The particular care of someone who is about to say something that they know will hit hard, and they want to make sure the landing is as soft as it can be given that it's still going to hurt. Margaret set down her mug. "Okay," she said, "tell me." "The department called last night, Chief Howell personally. He wants a meeting, not formal, not legal offices and representatives. He wants to come here, to this house, and he wants to apologize." Margaret was quiet. He also said, Caleb glanced at a notepad on the counter, making sure he got this right, that the department is launching a full formal investigation into Caldwell's conduct, not just yesterday, but going back through his record. He said there are indications that yesterday was not an isolated incident. "It wasn't," Margaret said. Caleb looked at her. "Patricia's not the first person to call me," she said. "Maria Gutierrez called me yesterday evening while you were outside. She told me what happened to her 3 months ago. And she apologized to me. Can you imagine? She apologized. Like she had done something wrong by not coming forward sooner. Like it was her fault she didn't believe anyone would listen." Caleb said nothing for a moment. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was working hard to stay controlled. She had watched him do that since he was 11 years old, and it was one of the things she had always been most proud of in him. That capacity for discipline, for measured response, for choosing the right action over the satisfying one. Thomas had taught him that, by example, by patience, by 30 years of choosing to fix things rather than break them. "Tell Howell to come at 2, Margaret said, "and tell him to bring whoever he needs to bring to make the things I'm going to ask for actually happen. Because I'm not interested in sitting across from someone who wants to feel better about yesterday. I'm interested in what changes on the day after yesterday." Caleb nodded slowly. He reached for his phone. Then he stopped. He looked at her. "Mom," he said, "yeah. How are you actually doing? Not for television, not for the chief of police. Just how are you doing?" Margaret looked at her coffee cup. She turned it slowly in her hands. She thought about Thomas's photograph with the crack across the glass. She thought about the parking lot, the crowd of people who didn't speak, the sound of her own breath when the cuff went on too tight, the way she had stood there alone in the middle of all those witnesses and felt that particular loneliness that is specifically the loneliness of being disbelieved. She thought about the sound of 500 engines arriving. She thought about Caleb walking across the parking lot and the way his voice had been so perfectly steady when he asked that one question. She thought about lying on the operating table 3 days ago and making herself breathe slowly and thinking about Thomas's unfinished motorcycle and the promise she had made and the fact that she was not done yet. She was simply not done yet. "I'm okay," she said. "I'm tired. My wrist hurts and my doctor is going to be furious with me and I need to sleep about 12 more hours, but I'm okay." She looked up at him. "I'm more okay than the people who thought no one would listen," she said. "That's the part I can't let go of. That's the part that keeps me moving." Caleb nodded once. He made the call. And outside, the 3 bikes in the driveway caught the morning light, the way metal does when the sun hits it clean quietly without ceremony. Simply present in the way that solid things are present when they have decided to stay. Thomas's Harley was in the garage. The photograph was on the nightstand with the cracked glass because Margaret had refused to throw it away. And the town of Red Valley, Montana was about to discover that a grandmother from Calhoun Street had a great deal more to say. Chief Gerald Howell arrived at Caleb's house at 2 o'clock exactly. He came alone. That was the first thing Margaret noticed. No deputy, no public relations officer, no lawyer, with a briefcase full of careful language. Just Gerald Howell, 54 years old in his dress uniform, standing on the front porch of a house surrounded by motorcycles with his hat in his hands. Caleb answered the door. The two men looked at each other for a moment, the chief of police and the president of the local Hells Angels chapter. And something passed between them that was not warmth exactly, but was not hostility either. It was the recognition of two people who have been circling each other for years in a small town and understand in this specific moment that they are on the same side of something for the first time. Chief, Caleb said. Mr. Whitmore, Howell said. Dawn, and thank you for letting me come. My mother asked you here, Caleb said. Thank my mother. He stepped aside. Howell walked in. Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee and her notepad and the reading glasses she always pretended she didn't need. She looked up when he came in, and she studied him the way she studied everyone, not unkindly but completely taking in the whole picture before she decided what she thought of it. Howell sat down across from her without being asked. He placed his hat on the table. He looked at her wrist, the dark purple bruise visible below her sleeve, and something moved through his face that was not performance. It was the genuine discomfort of a person who is responsible for an institution that has caused harm and knows it. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I want to start by saying something plainly without qualifications or department language. What happened to you yesterday was wrong. It was wrong from the moment Officer Caldwell made his first assumption, and it compounded with every decision he made after that. You were treated without dignity, without fairness, and without the basic respect that every person in this community deserves. I am sorry. Personally and professionally, I am sorry. Margaret looked at him steadily. Are you sorry, she said? Or is the department sorry because 4 million people watched it happen? Howell didn't flinch. Both, he said. I won't insult you by pretending the visibility doesn't matter. It does. But I also won't pretend that the visibility is the only thing that matters to me, because it isn't. I have been doing this job for 22 years, Mrs. Whitmore. I got into it because I believed in something. Yesterday showed me that somewhere between that belief and the present day, something went wrong in my department that I did not catch. That is on me. Silence. Margaret tapped her pen once against the notepad. Tell me about the other incidents, she said. Howell's expression shifted slightly. You know about those? I know about 2 of them. Patricia Osei told me this morning that she's found a third. A young man from out of town 6 months ago traffic stop that lasted nearly an hour for no documented reason. She paused. Did you know about any of them before yesterday? Howell was quiet for 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds were their own answer. There were informal notations, he said carefully, mumbling that rose to the level of formal complaint. Because the people it happened to didn't believe a formal complaint would go anywhere, Margaret said. Which means the system didn't just fail them once when the incident happened. It failed them twice by being the kind of system that people have given up on before they even try. Caleb was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Howell leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Whitmore, what do you want? Not rhetorically, specifically. Tell me what you want to come out of this, and I will tell you honestly what I can and cannot do. Margaret opened her notepad. She had been writing since 7 in the morning. She read from it without preamble. Mandatory community engagement training for every officer, not optional, not reschedulable because someone happened to be on leave when it ran. Body camera activation requirements with real consequences for noncompliance. An independent civilian review board with actual authority, not advisory status, actual authority to review misconduct cases and make binding recommendations. A formal process for people to report incidents that doesn't require them to walk into a police station and file paperwork in front of the people they're reporting. And a public accounting of the Caldwell incidents, not a press release of full accounting. The people he stopped deserve to have their experiences acknowledged officially. She closed the notepad. That's what I want, she said. Not for me. I have 500 people who showed up for me yesterday. I want it for the people who don't. The kitchen was very quiet. Howell looked at the notepad, then he looked at Margaret. I can't promise all of that today, he said. Some of it requires city council approval, some of it requires budget authorization. But I can tell you that I am going to walk out of this house and begin working on every single item on that list, and I am going to do it in public with documentation so that you can hold me to it. I will, she said simply. You should know that about me. Howell almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that comes when someone respects you too much to be amused and too much to hide the fact that they are. I'm beginning to understand that, he said. He picked up his hat. He started to stand. One more thing, Margaret said. He stopped. Ryan Caldwell is 26 years old, she said. What he did was wrong. What the pattern of his behavior suggests about his training and his assumptions is a serious problem. But I am not asking you to destroy him. I am asking you to fix what produced him. Because he didn't come out of nowhere. He came out of a system. Fix the system. Howell looked at her for a long moment. I'll do my best, he said. I know you will, she said, or I wouldn't have let you in the door. He left. Caleb waited until the car pulled away, and then he came and sat down at the table and looked at his mother's notepad. You wrote all that this morning, he said. I woke up at 4, she said. Old habit. He shook his head slowly. He's going to try to bury some of that in committee reviews and budget cycles. I know, she said. That's why Patricia Osei is publishing her piece tomorrow, and Sandra Leach is running her interview Thursday, and I have a meeting with the mayor's office on Friday. Caleb stared at her. Mom, don't look at me like that. I'm not fragile. You had open heart surgery 6 days ago. Thomas had a heart attack and spent the next 3 months rebuilding an engine, she said. It's genetic. He laughed. It was a short, surprise laugh, the kind that gets out before a person can decide whether it's appropriate, but it was real, and it broke something open in the room that had been too tight since the day before, and for a moment they were just a mother and son at a kitchen table, laughing at something the man they both missed would have said himself. Then Caleb's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His expression changed. It's Phil Donovan, he said, Caldwell's union rep. Margaret looked up sharply. Why is he calling you? I don't know, Caleb answered. Yeah, he lit. The silence lasted about 40 seconds. Margaret watched her son's face move through something complicated. Surprise, then a kind of grim understanding, then something she couldn't quite name. Okay, Caleb said. I'll let her know. He hung up. He set the phone down on the table very deliberately. Ryan Caldwell, he said slowly, is requesting a meeting with you. The kitchen held its breath. Not through legal channels, Caleb continued. Not through the department. He called Phil directly off the record and asked if there was any possibility of sitting down with you personally. Phil says Caleb checked the notepad he'd been writing on during the call. Phil says he's not doing well, says he watched the video last night and didn't sleep. Margaret was very still. Phil wants me to tell you, Caleb said, that this is completely your choice and that nobody is going to pressure you either way and that whatever you decide is the right decision. Margaret looked at the notepad with her list on it. She thought about what she had told Howell. I am not asking you to destroy him. Fix the system. She thought about 26 years old. She thought about television shows everyone watched and absorbing the same assumptions. Everyone absorbed entering a system that had not bothered to properly train him before sending him out into a community with a badge and the authority to make decisions that change people's lives. She thought about how she had always had believed it through every hard thing life had handed her, that people were redeemable, that the capacity for genuine change existed in almost everyone, that the question was never really whether a person could change, but whether the right conditions ever arrived to make change possible. Tell Phil yes, she said. Caleb looked at her. Mom. Tell him yes, she said again. Thursday, here, 1 hour. No cameras, no press, no recordings. Just him and me and whoever he wants to bring for support. She paused. And you. I'll be civil, Caleb said in a tone that suggested he was making a genuine effort. I know you will, Margaret said, because that's what your father would have done. That settled it. That always settled it. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Patricia Osei was sitting in her car outside the Billings Gazette building on the phone with a third person, a young man named Marcus Webb Jr. No relation to the deputy chief, 22 years old, who had been driving through Red Valley, visiting his aunt when Caldwell had pulled him over 6 months ago. Marcus had not wanted to talk at first. He had told Patricia on the first call that he just wanted to move on, that going back into it wasn't something he had the energy for, that he had spent 3 weeks after the incident not sleeping well, and he had finally gotten to a place where he could sleep again, and he wasn't sure he wanted to disturb that. Patricia had not pushed. She had said, I understand. If you change your mind, here's my number. He had changed his mind at 8:30 that morning after watching the video of Margaret Whitmore in the parking lot 3 times. She's a grandmother, he said to Patricia on the second call. She just wanted to bring a motorcycle home, and he treated her like... He stopped, started over. He treated her the way he treated me, and she's a grandmother. Tell me what happened, Patricia said. So he told her. Oni had been driving his aunt's car, a newer model sedan, well-maintained, no violations on Route 12 at 2 in the afternoon. Caldwell had pulled up behind him and run his plates. The plates were clean. Caldwell had pulled him over anyway. He had sat on the side of Route 12 for 47 minutes. Caldwell had searched the car with Marcus's reluctant consent given after Caldwell had explained in a tone that made it clear refusal would make things considerably more complicated, and found nothing. Because there was nothing to find. When Caldwell finally let him go, he hadn't apologized. He hadn't explained. He had simply handed Marcus his license back and said, "Drive safe," as if the previous 47 minutes had been a mutual and agreeable experience. Marcus had driven 2 miles before he had to pull over because his hands were shaking too hard to hold the wheel straight. He had never filed a complaint. "My aunt told me not to," he said to Patricia. "She said it wouldn't go anywhere and it would only make things worse for me." And I believed her, because she'd lived in this town for 30 years and she knew. He paused. "Mrs. Whitmore is making it go somewhere. She's the reason I'm talking to you." "Can I quote you?" Patricia asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Use my full name, Marcus Anthony Webb II. I want it on record." Patricia wrote it down. She ended the call and sat in her car for a moment looking at her notes. 3 people, 3 incidents, 1 officer, a pattern that had been visible if anyone had been looking in the right places for at least 6 months. She thought about all the people who hadn't called her, because you never knew the full number. That was the thing about this kind of harm. You only ever saw the ones who decided to speak, and behind them, there was always a larger invisible count of people who had decided for perfectly rational reasons, rooted in perfectly real experiences, that speaking was not worth what it cost. She started writing. She wrote until 2 in the morning. The piece published at 7 the next day. It was 6,000 words, and it named every name that the people involved had given her permission to name, and it documented every incident with timestamps and cross-references and the exact language from Caldwell's official reports, which Patricia had obtained through a public records request she had filed the previous afternoon. The headline read, "One officer, 3 incidents, a community that stopped believing anyone would listen." By 9 in the morning, it had been read 400,000 times. By noon, it had been picked up by the Associated Press. By 3 in the afternoon, the Red Valley Police Department had announced the formal suspension of Officer Ryan Caldwell, pending a comprehensive review of his conduct record. Caldwell heard about the suspension from Phil Donovan, who called him at 3:17. I was sitting in his apartment. He had not left since the morning after the parking lot. He had watched the video 7 times, not from self-punishment, or not only from self-punishment, but because something in him kept needing to look at it, kept returning to the 12 minutes of footage, the way a person returns to a wound to check whether it is still real. It was still real every time. He watched himself, say, step away from the bike, and he watched himself reach into the saddlebag, and he watched the photograph fall, and he watched Margaret's face, and he watched the envelope sitting unopened on the trailer rail for 25 minutes, and he thought with the specific clarity that arrives after the adrenaline is completely gone and the justifications have all dissolved, I knew. Somewhere in those 25 minutes, I knew I was wrong, and I kept going anyway. That was the part he couldn't get past. Not the initial mistake he had been working on, accepting the initial mistake. People made initial mistakes. Assumptions were trained into people, baked in by culture and media, and 1,000 unconscious messages absorbed over a lifetime. He could understand the initial mistake even as he held himself responsible for it. What he couldn't rationalize was the moment he could place it almost exactly at around the 12-minute mark, when David Soren had spoken up from the crowd and said, "That's Margaret Whitmore." Everybody in this town knows that bike, when something in him had known, had clearly, unmistakably known, and he had told that person to step back, and he had kept going. That was a choice. Not an assumption, a choice. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a mistake and something worse. Phil told him about the suspension. Caldwell said, "Okay." Phil said, "Ryan, I need you to hear me. The union will represent you through the review process. You have rights, and we will protect them. But I also need you to understand that the evidence picture here is it's not good. The 3 incidents, the pattern, The video. A good outcome for you at this point looks very different from what it looked like 3 days ago. What does a good outcome look like? Caldwell asked. Phil was quiet for a moment. Honestly, it starts with Thursday. Thursday was the meeting with Margaret Whitmore. Caldwell had requested it in a moment that felt less like a decision and more like an inevitability. The sense that there was one thing he could do that was real. One thing that could not be spun or processed through official channels or managed by representatives, and it was to sit across from the woman he had put handcuffs on and look at her directly and say the things that needed to be said. He didn't know if she would accept. When Phil called him, hauled him back Wednesday morning and told him she had said yes, he sat very still for almost a full minute. Then he said, "Thank you." Phil said, "Don't thank me, show up." He showed up. Thursday at 1 in the afternoon, Ryan Caldwell drove to Caleb Whitmore's house in his personal car wearing jeans and a gray shirt because Phil had advised him not to come in uniform, and he had agreed that Phil was right. He had Phil beside him in the passenger seat. He parked on the street because the driveway held motorcycles, walked up the front steps and knocked on the door. Caleb opened it. The two men looked at each other. Caldwell was 6 feet tall. Caleb was 3 inches taller and broader everywhere, and wearing an expression that was carefully, precisely neutral, the expression of a man who has made a specific decision about what he is going to do in this hour and is committed to it regardless of how difficult the commitment becomes. "Come in," Caleb said. They sat in the living room. Margaret in the armchair she had clearly claimed as her established position, upright, composed, reading glasses pushed up on her head. Caleb on the couch to her left. Caldwell and Phil on the couch across from them. The room was very quiet. Caldwell looked at Margaret's wrist. The bruise had gone deeper in the days since the way bruises do, moving through purple into something darker at the edges. It was visible below her sleeve. He had put that there. He had stood there with a key in his hand and put that there. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and then stopped. Because he had rehearsed this. He had spent 2 days rehearsing it. He had written things down and crossed them out and started again, and he had arrived at what he believed was the right way to say the things he needed to say. And now that he was in the room with her, looking at her directly, every prepared sentence had simply left him. So he said the unprepared thing. "I looked at you and I decided what you were before I knew anything about you," he said. "And nothing you said or showed me or asked me to do in the 30 minutes after that was enough to make me reconsider. Not because the evidence wasn't there. It was there. It was right in front of me the whole time." His voice was steady, but only through visible effort. "I kept going because I had already decided, and admitting I'd decided wrong would have meant admitting it in front of all those people. And I was more afraid of that than I was committed to doing the right thing." He stopped. Margaret was looking at him, not with anger, not with the particular cold evaluation he had been bracing for. With something more complex, the expression of a person who has been listening for something specific and has just heard it. "That's the most honest thing you could have said," she told him. Caldwell looked at his hands. "It doesn't fix anything." "No," she agreed, "it doesn't. But it's the beginning of fixing yourself, which is the only thing that has a chance of fixing anything else." She paused. "How old are you?" 26. "Thomas was 26 when he made the biggest mistake of his life," she said. "He spent the next 40 years making it right, not by talking about it, by what he did every day after." She let that sit for a moment. "What you did to me was wrong. What you did to Marcus Webb and Robert Ashford and Maria Gutierrez was wrong. The question is what you do with the knowledge that it was wrong." Caldwell was very still. "I've been thinking about leaving the force," he said quietly. Caleb, who had been silent for the entire exchange, spoke for the first time. "Is that what you want, or is that what feels easiest right now?" Caldwell looked at him surprised. "Because running away from it doesn't fix anything for the next person who encounters an officer who makes the same assumptions you made," Caleb said. His voice was level. It cost him something Margaret could see, that could see the precise internal effort it was taking her son to extend this particular consideration to this particular person. But he was doing it because that was what his father would have done. If you genuinely want to fix what you broke, you have to stay inside the system that broke it and fight to change it from there. That's harder than leaving. It's also more useful. The room absorbed that. Phil Donovan was writing nothing. He had stopped writing the moment Caldwell started talking and had simply been listening with the expression of a man who has been in a lot of difficult rooms in his career and knows when something real is happening. The review will determine whether I still have a badge to go back to, Caldwell said. It will, Caleb said. But what you do now, how you behave during this process, whether you cooperate fully, whether you tell the truth about all of it, including the other incidents that will determine what kind of person goes back to work with or without a badge. Margaret reached forward and picked up her coffee cup. She took a slow sip. She looked at Ryan Caldwell over the rim. I'm going to say something to you that I want you to remember, she said. Not because I think you deserve it, but because I think it might be useful. Are you listening? He nodded. The photograph you knocked off that trailer, she said. The man in that photograph was a veteran and a mechanic and a father and the best person I ever knew. He spent 30 years fixing motorcycles for people who couldn't afford to pay him. He never asked for recognition. He never needed the world to know his name. He just showed up every day and did the right thing for whoever was standing in front of him. She set down the cup. He would have fixed your bike for free. He would have shaken your hand and meant it, and you would have looked at him in a parking lot and made the same decision you made about me. Caldwell's jaw tightened. I know, he said. I know. That's the thing you have to live with, Margaret said. Not the consequences from the department, not the video, not the press. The thing you have to live with is knowing what you would have done and then choosing differently from here. Nobody spoke for a long time. Outside, the wind moved. Inside the garage, Thomas's Harley was waiting. Finally, Caldwell said in a voice stripped down to something entirely unguarded, Why are you doing this? Why did you say yes to this meeting? You don't owe me anything. Margaret looked at him for a moment. Because, she said slowly, I've been doing this for 68 years, fighting to be seen by people who decided I wasn't worth seeing. And in all that time, I never once met a person who changed by being written off. People change when someone refuses to write them off. She paused. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because I want you to become the kind of officer who sees the next Margaret Whitmore before he gets to the handcuffs. That's what I'm here for. Caldwell looked at her. For a moment, his composure broke entirely. Not dramatically, not with sound, but in the particular way of someone who has been holding something very heavy for several days and has just been given permission to set it down, even briefly, even incompletely. He nodded once. Then he stood up. He extended his hand. Margaret looked at it. She took it. They shook hands once briefly, and it was not forgiveness. It was something more precise than forgiveness, something that didn't have a clean name, but that everyone in the room recognized as real. After he left, Caleb came and sat beside his mother. Dad would have done exactly that, he said. I know, she said. She was tired. The bone-deep tired of someone who has been carrying a great deal for a long time and has just briefly put a piece of it down. But she was not done, because the next morning she had a meeting with the mayor's office. And the morning after that, Sandra Leach's interview was going to run on every regional affiliate in the state. And somewhere in the editorial offices of 3 national publications editors were reading Patricia Osei's piece and making phone calls and setting up their own follow-up stories. And in communities across the country, people who had stood in parking lots alone with no 500 motorcycles and no cameras and no one sending forward text, those people were watching a 68-year-old grandmother from Red Valley, Montana, and something in them was shifting. Something that felt carefully and tentatively, and for the first time in a long time, like the possibility of being heard. Margaret looked at Thomas's photograph on the table beside her. The cracked glass caught the afternoon light. She picked it up and held it for a moment. I'm not done yet, she told him quietly. Not even close. The mayor's office smelled like old coffee and new carpet, which Margaret decided was an accurate metaphor for most government buildings she had ever been inside. Mayor Daniel Reeves was 51 years old in his second term and had the particular energy of a politician who has just realized that something happening in his town has become significantly larger than his town. He was not a bad man. Margaret had voted for him twice. But she had also watched him long enough to know that he was the kind of leader who moved with the wind rather than against it, which meant he was currently very interested in being on the right side of this story because the wind was blowing hard in one direction and he was a practical person. She was okay with that. She had learned a long time ago that you worked with the tools available, not the tools you wished you had. She arrived at 9 in the morning with Caleb beside her, in a folder containing her notepad and 3 printed copies of Patricia Osei's article, which had now been read by more than 2 million people. and had generated enough editorial response that it was being cited in opinion pieces in publications that had never previously found reason to write about Red Valley, Montana. The mayor's chief of staff, a young woman named Andrea Cole, who had the efficient manner of someone doing the work of three people, simultaneously met them at the entrance and walked them to the conference room where Reeves was already waiting with the city attorney and two members of the city council. Margaret looked at the room. 5 people on one side of the table, 2 on the other. She sat down, opened her folder, and got directly to the point. "I'm going to assume you've all read Patricia Osei's piece," she said, "and I'm going to assume you've all seen the video, so I'm not going to spend time establishing the facts. I'm going to tell you what I want to happen and why, and then I'd like to hear what obstacles you're going to present and whether those obstacles are real or whether they're the kind that dissolve when enough people are watching." The city attorney, a man named Howard Bright, who had spent 20 years making uncomfortable conversations manageable, shifted in his chair. Reeves looked at Margaret with an expression that was somewhere between respect and the specific discomfort of a man who has been accustomed to controlling the pace of a meeting and has just realized that is not going to happen today. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "please," she read from her list. It was the same list she had given Howell, with 3 additions she had developed after the Thursday meeting with Caldwell and after 2 days of phone calls from people she had never met, people from other towns, other states, people who had watched the video and then called the number that Jason Miller had listed in his original post because they had their own parking lot stories and no one had ever asked them to tell them. The 3 additions were these: a dedicated non-emergency reporting line, staffed by trained civilian counselors, not dispatchers; a quarterly public report on all misconduct complaints filed against officers with outcomes published on the city website and mailed in summary form to every household in the district; and a community liaison position paid full-time reporting to both the police department and the Civilian Review Board, whose specific job was to be the person that the Maria Gutierrezes and the Marcus Webbs of Red Valley called when something happened and they didn't know what to do next. She finished reading. The room was quiet. Howard Bright said carefully, "Some of these items require budget allocation that would need to go through the council's appropriations process." "Then start the process," Margaret said. "I'm not asking for it to happen tomorrow. I'm asking for it to be started today on the record with a timeline." Reeves looked at the 2 council members. One of them, a woman named Councilwoman Janet Price, who had been taking notes since Margaret started speaking, gave a small nod. "The Civilian Review Board is something we've discussed before," Price said. "It stalled in committee 18 months ago because there wasn't sufficient community momentum." "Is there sufficient community momentum now?" Margaret asked. Price looked at her. "Yes," she said plainly, "there is." Reeves leaned forward. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want to be transparent with you about something. The attention this situation has received nationally, has created a context in which acting quickly feels politically necessary. I want you to know that I am aware of how that looks, and I want to tell you that despite how it looks, my commitment to following through on these changes is not contingent on the news cycle." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. "I'll believe it when I see the Civilian Review Board seated and the first quarterly report published. Until then, I'm going to keep being a person who attends public meetings and asks questions." Reeves said, "I wouldn't expect anything else." "Good," yet she said. "Then we understand each other." The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was longer than anyone on the mayor's side had planned for. By the end of it, there was a written commitment, not a press release, an actual written commitment with signatures to begin the formal process for each item on Margaret's list within 30 days, with a public update scheduled at the city council meeting 6 weeks out. Andrea Cole walked them to the exit. At the door, she stopped. She said quietly, so that only Margaret could hear, "Mrs. Whitmore, my mother had something like this happen to her 10 years ago in Missoula. She never told anyone outside the family." A pause. "Thank you." Margaret looked at her. She thought about all the Andrea Coles, the ones who had watched something happen to someone they loved and stayed quiet because the world had taught them that quiet was the only option. "Tell your mother," Margaret said, "that she's not the only one." She walked out into the morning. The story broke wider 3 days later. Not because of anything Margaret did, not because of the mayor's commitment or the department's investigation or Patricia Osei's article. It broke wider because of Linda Parker. Linda Parker had, since the morning of the parking lot incident, been operating under the assumption that because she had not been publicly named in the original video, because the camera had caught the incident, but not the phone call that had initiated it, she was safely peripheral to the story. She had told two neighbors that she had simply reported what she saw, that she had been a concerned citizen doing her civic duty, that anyone would have called in a suspicious situation. One of those neighbors had been a woman named Carol Finch. Carol Finch had known Margaret Whitmore for 31 years. Carol had listened to Linda's account with the careful, neutral expression of someone who is hearing something that requires a response, but who is deciding what kind of response it deserves. She had waited 3 days. Then she had called Patricia Osei. Patricia, who was already working on the follow-up to her original piece, listened to what Carol told her, verified the detail through dispatch records. She had already obtained and published a second piece at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday with the straightforward headline, "The call that started it, false report identified in Whitmore incident." The piece did not name Linda Parker. It did not need to. Linda Parker had told enough people, enough details, that within 4 hours of the piece, publishing her name was circulating in the comments with a specificity that made it clear several Red Valley residents had connected the dots independently. Linda's phone rang at 8:15 that morning. It was her daughter calling from Denver. Mom to her daughter said, in the tone of someone who has just read something online and is trying to decide how upset to be and is landing fairly decisively on very upset. "Mom, did you make that call?" "I reported what I saw," Linda said. "You reported an old woman recovering from heart surgery loading her son's motorcycle onto a trailer. You reported that as a theft." "I didn't know." "You didn't try to know," her daughter said. "That's what it says in the article. You didn't ask her anything, you just called." Linda was quiet. In the silence, her daughter said the thing that cut deepest. "I know you don't like the motorcycles, Mom. I know you've never liked that family. But she just had heart surgery, and you called the police on her." Linda held the phone. Outside her window, the street was quiet. She had lived on this street for 19 years. She knew every house on it. She knew Margaret Whitmore's name, her son's name, the fact that Thomas had died 2 years ago. And the chapter had ridden past the house the day of the funeral in a column that had moved her despite herself, despite everything she had always told herself about those people and their motorcycles. She had been moved. And then the street had gone quiet again, and she had told herself a story about why the call had been reasonable, why anyone would have done it, why she had simply been cautious. Standing in her kitchen at 8:15 in the morning, with her daughter's voice in her ear, she understood with the specific clarity that arrives when there is no longer any version of the story that works, that the story she had been telling herself was wrong. She had not called because she was cautious. She had called because she had already decided who Margaret Whitmore was and wasn't. And she had been wrong. She said, "I need to think." Her daughter said, "Think fast, Mom, because people are talking." Linda sat down at her kitchen table. She sat there for a very long time. At noon, she called her own lawyer. At 2 in the afternoon, she called the non-emergency police line and asked to speak to someone about the process for addressing a report that may have been filed in error. At 4 o'clock, she did the thing that no one expected. She called Margaret Whitmore. Margaret's phone showed an unknown number. She answered anyway because she had been answering unknown numbers all week, and most of them had turned out to be people with something important to say. "Mrs. Whitmore," Linda said. Her voice was stripped down to something unadorned. No defensiveness, no justification. Just the voice of a person who is standing at the edge of something they have to do and knows it. "This is Linda Parker from Calhoun Street." Margaret was completely still. "I know who you are," she said. "I know you do." A long pause. "I'm not going to tell you that I didn't mean for things to go the way they went, because that kind of thing is something people say when they want credit for not intending the consequences of their own actions. I did make that call. I made it because of who I thought you were. And I was wrong about who you were, and I was wrong to make the call, and what happened to you because of it." Linda's voice caught briefly, then steadied. "Was wrong, I am sorry." The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb was in the doorway. He had heard his mother say, "I know who you are," and had come quietly to stand where he could hear the rest. And now he was watching his mother's face. Margaret's face was doing something complicated. "Linda," she said finally, "do you know what was in that saddlebag?" "The photograph," Linda said quietly. "I saw it in the video, when it fell." That photograph was taken in 1971, Margaret said. Thomas was 26 years old. He had just come back from his second tour. He was standing beside his first motorcycle, and he was smiling because he had survived everything that had tried to kill him, and he was home, and the world was still full of possibility. She paused. I carried that photograph for 53 years, through every house we ever lived in, through raising Caleb, through Thomas, getting sick, through the funeral, through every day since. It was the one thing I made sure never got left behind. Linda was silent. It has a crack in it now, Margaret said. The glass cracked when it hit the asphalt. I'm going to have it reframed, but the crack is there now. That's what your call cost me. Not the handcuffs, not the 30 minutes in a parking lot, the crack in that glass. Linda's breath was audible on the line. I know, she said. I know. I'm sorry, Margaret. It was the first time she had used her first name. In 31 years on the same street, it was the first time. Margaret noticed. I'm going to tell you what I told the police chief and the mayor and the young officer who put those cuffs on me, she said. I am not interested in punishment. I am interested in what changes. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think about it seriously. Not for me, for yourself. Okay, Linda said. Why share Rebecca? Margaret said simply. Not why did you call, I understand the mechanics of that. Why after 19 years of living 3 houses down from us did you not know who I was? What decisions did you make over those 19 years that meant you didn't know my name was Margaret, and that Thomas had served 2 tours, and that Caleb was the little boy who used to ride his bicycle on this street and fall down and cry and get up again? Why did 19 years of proximity produce so little knowledge? The silence on the other end was the silence of a person confronting a question they don't have a good answer to. I didn't let it, Linda said finally. I decided early, and I didn't let anything change it. Yes, Margaret said, that's it exactly. Another pause. What do you want me to do? Linda asked. I want you to go to the city council meeting in 6 weeks and speak in support of the Civilian Review Board, Margaret said. Not because it will fix what happened, because it might prevent it from happening to someone else. And because the kind of change I'm fighting for needs people like you, people who were wrong and know it in the room saying so. Linda Parker said nothing for a long moment. Then, okay. Okay, Margaret said. She hung up. Caleb looked at his mother. Who was that? He said, though his expression suggested he already knew. Linda Parker, Margaret said. The silence between them was enormous. Anne, Caleb said. She's coming to the council meeting, Margaret said. He looked at the ceiling, briefly, looked back at her, did the thing with his jaw. Got it under control. Thomas would not believe this week, he said finally. Thomas would believe it completely, Margaret said. He always believed people were better than they acted. He just thought most people needed a reason to prove it. She picked up Thomas's photograph from the table. She looked at the crack in the glass. She set it back down gently. Get me a good frame repair place, she said. I want it done before the council meeting. Sandra Leach's interview aired that Thursday evening on the regional affiliate at 9 o'clock. And by the time the broadcast ended, the station's comment lines were overwhelmed. Sandra had done exactly what she had promised Margaret she would do. Let her speak without interruption, without dramatic music beneath the voiceover, without the particular breathless framing that local news tended to apply to human interest stories. Just Margaret on camera, in Caleb's living room with Thomas's photograph on the table beside her and her coffee cup in her hand, telling the truth in her own voice. She talked about Thomas. She talked about the 30 years of free repairs and the people who came to him with nowhere else to go, and the way he had never made anyone feel like a charity case, had simply treated them like people who needed help, which was what they were. She talked about Caleb not as the chapter president, but as the boy who had followed his father around the garage with a wrench he was too small to use properly, absorbing through pure proximity the belief that the right thing was worth doing even when it cost you. She talked about the parking lot. She talked about what it felt like to stand in a crowd of 40 people and be disbelieved. The hardest part, she said, looking directly at the camera, in a way that Sandra would later tell her colleagues, was the single most effective moment she had captured in 15 years of broadcast journalism. Was not the handcuffs. The handcuffs hurt, and they were wrong, and they'll be documented and addressed. The hardest part was the 40 people who watched and stayed quiet. Because I understand why they stayed quiet. I don't blame them. The world teaches people that quiet is safer. And mostly the world is right about that. She paused. But the cost of that quiet is paid by the people who are standing there alone. And somebody has to start deciding that cost is too high. The interview ended. Sandra thanked her. Margaret thanked Sandra. After the cameras were packed and the crew had gone, Caleb sat beside her in the living room, and neither of them spoke for a while. Then he said, "The chapter wants to do something, to mark all this in some way, something meaningful." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Nothing loud," he said quickly. "Nothing that's about us. Something that's about you and Dad. The chapter has a fund. We raise money every year for local causes. They voted this week to direct a portion of it toward establishing the community liaison position you asked for before the city can fully fund it, to get someone in the role now rather than waiting for the budget process." Margaret looked at her son. "How much?" she asked. He named a figure. Margaret blinked. "That's Caleb, that's Dad spent 30 years fixing people's motorcycles for free," Caleb said simply. "He put more into this community than he ever took out. It seemed right." She looked at him for a long time. "He would have argued about it," she said. "He would have said the money should go somewhere else." "Yeah," Caleb said. "I know. That's how I knew it was right." The tears that came then were not the public kind, not the performed grief or the displayed emotion of someone who knows they are being watched. They were the private kind, the kind that comes in quiet rooms when love and loss arrive at the same moment, and the distance between those two things collapses completely. Caleb put his arm around his mother. She let him. Outside the window, the evening was coming in slowly, the particular deep blue of a Montana evening in early autumn, and somewhere down the street, the sound of a motorcycle engine caught and turned over. And the sound of it was familiar in the way only the sounds of your own life can be familiar. Not comforting exactly, but present. Real. The sound of something that had always been there and was still there and would continue to be there. Thomas's Harley was in the garage. The photograph was on the table. The crack in the glass caught the last of the light. And 4 days before the city council meeting, something happened that nobody had predicted. Ryan Caldwell's review concluded. The formal findings were 12 pages long and documented the parking lot incident in full cross-referenced with the 3 additional incidents identified by Patricia Osei, and included a formal finding of a pattern of behavior consistent with implicit bias in initial suspect assessment, compounded by failure to incorporate available evidence once the initial assessment was challenged. The conclusion was not termination. It was a finding that Caldwell would undergo mandatory retraining, 6 months of supervised patrol under a senior officer, and a formal probationary period of 1 year, during which any additional misconduct would result in immediate termination. The decision was controversial. Half the comments online said it was too lenient. Half said it was fair given his age and service record. A small number said it was too harsh. Chief Howell held a press conference. He read the findings. He read the remedies. Then he said without notes, "I want to be clear that this outcome reflects the department's belief that Officer Caldwell is capable of becoming a better officer than he has been. It also reflects a broader commitment to systemic change that is not contingent on one officer's outcome. What happened to Margaret Whitmore would not have been prevented solely by removing Ryan Caldwell from the force. It will be prevented by building a department and a community accountability structure that makes the next Ryan Caldwell unlikely to make the same mistakes, and more importantly, makes the next Margaret Whitmore far less likely to be alone in that parking lot for 32 minutes. He paused. "We failed Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "The officer failed her, the system failed her, and I failed her by not having systems in place that caught this pattern earlier. I intend to spend the rest of my tenure making sure that failure is the last of its kind in this department." A reporter from the back of the room raised her hand. "Chief Howell, have you spoken with Mrs. Whitmore since the review concluded?" "I called her this morning," Howell said. "What did she say?" Howell looked at the reporter. "She said, and I'm quoting her directly because I want to get this right," she said, "Gerald, the review is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. I'll see you at the council meeting." The press room was briefly unexpectedly quiet. Then someone laughed, just one person, but genuinely the real laugh that comes when something is phony, because it is true, and the tension in the room shifted into something slightly warmer. Margaret, watching the press conference on the television in Caleb's living room, did not laugh. She simply nodded at the screen. "See you there," she said quietly. The council meeting was 6 days away. She had a list. She had witnesses. She had 500 people who had been there from the beginning and were not going anywhere. And somewhere in the garage, under a tarp, Thomas's Harley was waiting, burgundy and chrome and patient the way everything Thomas had built had always been patient, waiting for the next morning when the light was right and the road was clear, and the woman who had kept her promise was ready to take it home. The city council meeting was scheduled for 7 in the evening. Margaret arrived at 6:15, not because she was anxious. She had stopped being anxious about public rooms somewhere around her 45th year, after enough PTA meetings and union negotiations in hospital waiting rooms had taught her that anxiety was a tax on time she did not have to spare. She arrived early because she wanted to sit in the room before it filled up, to feel the space to think about Thomas, the way she always thought about him before something important, which was quietly and without ceremony, and with the particular quality of attention that you give to someone whose voice you can no longer hear, but whose presence you have never stopped feeling. The chamber held 200 seats. By 6:30 it was half full. By 6:50 people were standing along the walls. By 7, when Mayor Reeves called the meeting to order, the room contained more people than it had held for any public session in 11 years, according to the city clerk, who would later note it for the record with the slightly dazed expression of someone witnessing a category of event they had previously only read about. Margaret sat in the front row. Caleb sat beside her. Behind them, filling the rows in a quiet, deliberate presence that was not threatening and was not incidental. It was simply and completely intentional, sat members of the Red Valley chapter and affiliated chapters from 4 surrounding towns. Not in their vests, Caleb had asked, and they had agreed, because this was not a night about the club. This was a night about the community. They wore regular clothes, and they sat straight, and they were as quiet and attentive as any audience Margaret had ever addressed. 3 rows back, Maria Gutierrez sat beside Robert Ashford, who she had never met before. Patricia Ossie had connected them the week prior. They had spoken on the phone twice and met in person for coffee on Tuesday, and discovered that what they shared was not only the specific experience of Officer Caldwell, but the broader and deeper experience of being people who had learned through repeated contact with systems that did not see them clearly, that speaking up was more likely to cost them something than to gain them anything. Tonight, they were going to speak up anyway. In the second row, Jason Miller sat with his sister Renee and their parents, who had driven in from Billings when Jason told them what was happening, and his mother had said without hesitation, "Then we'll be there." 4 rows from the back, Ryan Caldwell sat alone. He had not announced he was coming. He had told no one except Phil Donovan, who had said, "Are you sure?" And then when Caldwell said yes, had said okay and asked nothing further. He was not in uniform. He was not there to represent the department or defend himself or manage the optics of his presence. He was there because Margaret Whitmore had sat across from him in a living room and told him that change happened when people stayed in the room, and he was trying imperfectly and with considerable uncertainty about whether he deserved to be trying to believe her. He had recognized Robert Ashford when he walked in. Ashford had not seen him yet. Caldwell sat with his hands flat on his knees and breathed carefully and waited. And in the very last row in the aisle seat closest to the exit sat Linda Parker. She had almost not come. She had stood in her living room at 6 o'clock with her coat on and her keys in her hand and talked herself out of it 3 times. She had thought about the people who would recognize her. She had thought about the comments online. She had thought about sitting in a room full of people who knew what she had done and having to stay still in her own skin for the duration of it. And then she had thought about what Margaret had said on the phone. "What do you want me to do?" "Come to the council meeting and speak in support of the Civilian Review Board." Not as penance, not as performance, because change needed people who had been wrong and knew it. She had gotten in her car. Mayor Reeves opened the public comment session at 7:20. The first person to approach the microphone was Marcus Webb, Marcus Anthony Webb II, 22 years old, who had sat on the side of Route 12 for 47 minutes while his hands shook and his aunt's car was searched for nothing, and Caldwell had handed him his license back and said drive safe, like the previous 47 minutes had been agreeable to both of them. He stood at the microphone and he did not look at his notes. He looked at the council. "My name is Marcus Webb," he said. "I live in Billings. I was passing through Red Valley 6 months ago to visit my aunt. Officer Caldwell pulled me over. He searched my car for 47 minutes. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. I didn't file a complaint because I didn't think it would go anywhere. He paused. I'm here because of Mrs. Whitmore, because she was standing in a parking lot doing the same thing I was doing, existing in a place that someone decided she didn't belong. And the difference between her story and mine is that someone was recording. I want this council to understand that. The difference was a camera, not the experience. The experience was the same. He stepped back from the microphone. The room was very quiet. Maria Gutierrez went next. She spoke for 4 minutes about the van, the misunderstanding, the 45 minutes of careful explanation that had gone nowhere, the drive home during which she had cried, not from fear but from exhaustion, the specific exhaustion of a person who has spent energy trying to be seen and has come away empty. Robert Ashford spoke after her. He was a measured, careful man who chose his words with the precision of someone who has long understood that the way you say things determines whether people hear them. He talked about his 30 years in Red Valley. He talked about the traffic stop. He talked about the young man visiting his aunt who had driven away shaking because he had not wanted to make things worse. And he looked at the council and said very plainly, that young man was trying to protect himself from your system. When people are trying to protect themselves from the system, meant to protect them, the system has failed. The chamber absorbed each testimony, like ground absorbing rain, after a long dry period, not rejecting it, not overwhelmed by it, simply taking it in with the particular attentiveness of people who are finally hearing something they have needed to hear and are only now understanding how long they have needed it. Then Margaret walked to the microphone. The room shifted. Not loudly, not with applause or reaction. It was a shift in attention, the particular quality of attention that a room gives to the person it has been waiting for, the person whose presence has organized everything else that has happened. She set her folder on the podium. She looked at Mayor Reeves, at the council members, at the full and standing room behind her. She did not begin with the parking lot. She began with Thomas. My husband, Thomas Whitmore, fixed motorcycles in this town for 30 years, she said. He fixed them for people who could pay and people who couldn't, and he never made anyone feel the difference. He genuinely, completely believed that every person who walked through his door deserved to be treated as if their problem mattered. Not because they had proven they deserved it, not because they had established their credentials, but because they were a person, and that was sufficient. She paused. I'm standing here because a young police officer looked at me in a parking lot and decided I was not sufficient, she said. Not because of anything I did or said, because of what I looked like, where I was standing, and what I was standing next to. He made a decision in 4 seconds and held it for 32 minutes against every piece of evidence that contradicted it. Another pause. I am not here to relitigate those 32 minutes. You have the record, you have the video, you have the testimony of 3 people who experienced similar decisions from the same officer and stayed quiet because they had no reason to believe speaking would change anything. She looked at the council directly. I want to give people a reason to believe it changes something. That is what I am asking you to do tonight. She read from her list, every item, with the timeline she had negotiated with the mayor's office, with the budget figures that Councilwoman Price's office had prepared, with the specific language she had spent a week refining with 2 legal advocates who had contacted her after the video went wide and offered to help without charge, because what they did was exactly this: turn individual grievances into systemic change. She finished. She looked up. I know this is a lot, she said. I know budget cycles are real and processes take time and systems move slowly. I have been alive for 68 years and I have watched systems move slowly my entire life. But I want this council to understand something. Her voice dropped, slightly, became less formal, became the voice of a woman talking to other people in a room rather than a speaker addressing a body. Every day this takes is another day that someone stands in a parking lot alone. Every committee delay is another Marcus Webb on the side of a road with his hands shaking. Every process that gets extended past its deadline is another Maria Gutierrez driving home crying from exhaustion. The system moves slowly. The harm doesn't. She picked up her folder. She walked back to her seat. The room did something that city council chambers almost never do. It stayed completely silent for 4 full seconds. And then it did not applaud, because this was not that kind of moment, and the people in that room understood It was not that kind of moment, but the quality of the silence changed into something that was its own form of recognition. The acknowledgement of a room that has heard something real. Reeves cleared his throat. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. And then after a brief pause during which he appeared to be deciding something, "Are there additional public comments?" The hand that went up in the back of the room belonged to Linda Parker. Margaret did not turn around, but she heard the rustle of movement, heard the microphone pick up the footsteps, heard the slight catch of breath in the room as people recognized her. Linda Parker stood at the podium. She looked out at the room. "My name is Linda Parker," she said. "I live on Calhoun Street, 3 houses down from Margaret Whitmore, where I have lived for 19 years. She stopped, started again. "I made the call that brought the police to 5th Street that morning. I reported what I described as a suspicious situation involving an elderly woman and a motorcycle. What I actually saw was my neighbor loading her son's bike onto a trailer." Another stop. The room was so quiet you could hear the ventilation. "I did not ask her what she was doing. I did not speak to her. I looked at a woman I had lived 3 houses from for 19 years, and I decided what she was without knowing her. And then I made a call that resulted in her being handcuffed in a parking lot 3 days after open-heart surgery." The room held its breath. "I am not standing here because someone made me," Linda said. "I am standing here because Mrs. Whitmore asked me to, and because she asked me to do something specific. She asked me to support the Civilian Review Board. She asked me to come into this room and say in public that I was wrong, not because it changes what happened, but because change needs people who can admit they were wrong." She looked at the council. "I support every item on Mrs. Whitmore's list, and I am sorry, to her family, and to this community." She stepped back. She walked to her seat. The room remained quiet. And then something happened that no one had planned. Caleb Whitmore stood up. He did not go to the microphone. He simply stood in the 3rd row, and he looked at Linda Parker, and he gave her a single nod. Brief, deliberate, the nod of a man who does not give acknowledgement cheaply and is giving it now because it has been earned. Linda Parker, who had been staring at her hands since she sat down, looked up. She saw the nod. Her eyes filled. She nodded back. The council voted at 9:14. Every item passed. Not unanimously, 2 council members had procedural objections to the timeline on the budget items, which were real objections that were noted and would require additional review, because these things always required additional review, and Margaret had known that going in and had built room for it in her expectations. But the core commitments, the Civilian Review Board, the body camera policy, the independent reporting mechanism, the community liaison position, all passed. All on record, all with timelines attached. Reeves brought the gavel down. Margaret sat in her chair and felt the particular quality of exhaustion that is not depletion, but completion, the exhaustion of someone who has carried something far and has arrived finally at the place they were carrying it toward. Caleb's hand found hers under the armrest. She held on. After the chamber cleared, she stayed seated for a few minutes. People came to speak with her council members, community members, Patricia Osei, Sandra Leach, Maria Gutierrez, who held her hands for a long moment and said thank you, and Margaret said no thank you. "You're the one who agreed to be named," and Maria said, "You made it possible to believe it mattered." And they stood there in the emptying room holding hands like 2 people who have survived something difficult together, which was exactly what they were. Jason Miller came to say goodbye. He was awkward about it in the way of 23-year-olds who have done something significant and are not sure how to carry it. "I just took a video," he said. "You took a video and you sent a text and you waited in that parking lot until it was over," Margaret said. "Don't minimize what that cost you. Being the person who speaks when everyone else is quiet is not a small thing." He nodded, slightly red around the ears. "My aunt wants to meet you," he said. "She watched the council meeting online. She said to tell you that she's proud of her town tonight." "Tell her to come for coffee," Margaret said. "Any morning." He smiled. He left. The chamber was nearly empty when Ryan Caldwell approached. He had waited. He had sat in his row while everyone else filed out, watching, not from hesitation, but from the same deliberateness that had brought him here in the first place. The understanding that he did not have the right to the center of this evening, that his presence was permitted, not entitled, and that the correct thing to do was wait until everyone else had had what they came for before he took a moment of her time. Margaret saw him coming. She did not stiffen. She waited. He stopped a few feet away. Caleb beside her was very still. "The vote," Caldwell said. "Everything on your list. Congratulations." "It's a beginning," Margaret said. "Yes." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. "I also wanted to tell you I received my assignment for the supervised patrol period. My senior officer is Marcus Webb, Deputy Chief Webb." He paused. "He requested me specifically. He said he wanted the officer from that parking lot working under someone who understood exactly what the failure was." Margaret looked at him steadily. "Marcus Webb is a good man," she said. "I know," Caldwell said. "I looked him up. 20 years on the force, 3 commendations for community engagement, helped design the first version of the Citizen Liaison program in Billings." Another pause. "I think he's going to be hard on me." "Good," Margaret said. Something moved in Caldwell's face, something that was not quite a smile but was in the same territory. "Yes," he said. "Good." He started to go, then he stopped. He reached into his jacket pocket and held out a small rectangular package wrapped in plain brown paper. "I had the glass replaced," he said, "on the frame. I found a repair shop in Billings that does antique frames, and I took a photograph of the frame from the video, and they matched it exactly. The glass is new, but the frame is the same." He set the package carefully on the chair beside her. "I know it doesn't fix the crack that was in the original." "I know it doesn't." He stopped. Tried again. "It's not enough. I know it's not enough, but it's what I could do." Margaret looked at the package. She looked at Ryan Caldwell. She thought about 26 years old and the weight of knowing exactly what you did wrong and having to carry that knowledge forward into every day after. She thought about Thomas, who had been 26 once, who had made his own serious mistakes and spent 40 years choosing differently because of them. "Caleb," she said. Her son looked at her. "Go get Thomas's photograph from the car." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket where he had been carrying it because she had asked him to bring it tonight. She had not explained why, but she had asked, and he had brought it. He handed it to her. She held the photograph with the cracked glass in its old frame, and she held the new frame in the brown paper wrapping, and she looked at them both. Then she held the cracked frame out to Caldwell. "Take this," she said. He looked startled. "Mrs. Whitmore, I can't. I'm not giving it to you as a gift," she said. "I'm giving it to you as a reminder. Every time you look at that crack, I want you to remember what assumption costs. Not as punishment, as education." She held it steady until he took it. "And I want you to keep doing the work that earns you the right to carry it." Caldwell took the frame. He held it like something that might break further if handled wrong. "I will," he said. He left. Margaret opened the brown paper package and looked at the new frame. The same carved wood, the same dimensions, the new clear glass without a mark on it. She opened the old frame, carefully removed the photograph of Thomas at 26, grinning beside his first motorcycle, and transferred it to the new frame. She closed the clasp. She held it up. Thomas looked back at her, same as always, young and grinning, and completely certain that whatever came next, he could handle it. "There you are," she said quietly. Caleb put his arm around her. They sat together in the empty chamber for a few minutes, just the two of them, in the particular piece of people who have done something that needed doing and are now on the other side of it. "I want to ride the Harley home," Margaret said. Caleb looked at her. "Mom." "Not by myself," she said. "Behind you, the way I used to ride with your father." He looked at her for a long moment, at the 68 years of her, the surgery scar, in the healed wrist, in the photograph in her hands, in the complete unshakable certainty in her eyes. "Your doctor. My doctor can come to the council meeting next time," she said. He laughed. It was Thomas's laugh, the same surprised by joy laugh, arriving before he could decide whether it was appropriate, warm, and real, and filling the empty room with something that felt exactly like what it was. "Okay," he said. "Okay, Mom." They walked out together. Outside, the chapter was waiting, not 500 this time. The core 40-50 people who had been there from the beginning and had stayed. They were on their bikes, engines off, quiet, in the specific way of people who are present out of love rather than obligation. Caleb walked to the Harley Thomas's Harley Burgundy and Chrome and finally completely home, and he swung his leg over and settled in and started the engine. The sound of it filled the air. Margaret stood beside the bike. She held Thomas's photograph against her chest with one hand. She looked at the engraved wings below the gas cap. She put her hand on her son's shoulder. He reached back and held her hand for a moment. squeezed once firm and steady, the way Thomas used to squeeze before something began. She climbed on. The chapter started their engines. Not all at once, one by one in a wave that started at the front and rolled back through the group, each engine turning over until the street was full of sound, not chaotic but ordered, the sound of a community that has always known how to move together. They rode through Red Valley, through the streets that Thomas had driven for 30 years, past the garage where he had worked, in the streets where Caleb had ridden a bicycle and fallen down, and gotten up past the hardware store on 5th Street where Margaret had stopped to tighten a tie-down 11 days ago and changed everything. Past the parking lot. Margaret looked at it as they rode by, the asphalt where the photograph had fallen, the trailer rail where the envelope had sat unopened, the space where she had stood alone for 32 minutes, surrounded by 40 people, and felt the specific loneliness of being disbelieved. She looked at it and she did not look away. Because the things she had learned, not in the council chamber, not in the meeting with the chief, not in the parking lot itself, but in all the accumulated years before it, the thing she had learned was that you did not heal from difficult things by pretending they had not happened. You healed by carrying them forward honestly, by letting them change the shape of what you did next, by refusing to let the worst moment define you, while also refusing to pretend it had not occurred. The parking lot was part of the story. It was not the end of it. They turned on to Calhoun Street. Margaret's house was at the end of the block, the house she and Thomas had bought 34 years ago, when Caleb was small. The house where she had raised her son and buried her husband and received the phone call that the surgery had been scheduled, and packed her bag for the hospital and thought carefully and specifically about a promise she had made. Caleb pulled the Harley into the driveway. The chapter pulled up along the street, engines cutting one by one in that same rolling wave until there was silence. The kind of silence that a neighborhood gets when it is full of people who are all holding the same breath. Margaret climbed off the bike. She stood in her own driveway with Thomas's photograph in one hand and her son beside her, and 40 motorcycles on her street, and she felt the particular completeness of a person who has arrived somewhere they were always moving toward, even on the days when they could not see where they were going. She looked at the photograph. She looked at Caleb. Your father would have fixed every single one of their bikes tonight, she said, for free. And then he would have gone inside and made coffee and not said a word about it. Caleb smiled. I know, he said. He was a better person than either of us, she said. Yeah, Caleb said, but we're trying. Margaret looked at her house. She thought about everything inside it, the ordinary accumulated evidence of a life, the dishes and the photographs in the couch cushion with the permanent indent where Thomas had always sat, the nightstand sign that said, don't get up without telling someone, and the cup she had left in the sink the morning she had driven to Red Valley Custom Garage before the sun was fully up. She thought about the meeting she had tomorrow with the advocate who was helping establish the legal framework for the Civilian Review Board. She thought about the call she had scheduled with Marcus Webb Jr., who wanted to talk about how to formalize his testimony into something the department could use in training. She thought about the letter she had started writing to Robert Ashford about the non-emergency reporting line, and the coffee invitation she had extended to Jason Miller's aunt, and the quiet ongoing work of turning one morning in a parking lot into something that would outlast the news cycle and the public interest in the 11 days of visibility. The work was not done, it was barely started, but it was real and it was moving and it was pointed in the right direction. She turned back to the street. She raised her hand, not dramatically, not with performance, just the simple gesture of a woman acknowledging the people who had come. 40 people on 40 motorcycles raised their hands back. She nodded once. She went inside. Caleb followed. The chapter waited until the light came on in the kitchen window. That was, the signal had always been the signal that she was in and she was okay. And then they started their engines one more time and they rode out the way they had come through Red Valley in the dark, in a column that had no beginning. You could see from the front and no end. You could see from the back, the sound of them moving through the quiet streets like a river that has found its proper course at last. In the kitchen, Margaret set Thomas's photograph on the table. She put the kettle on. She sat down. She looked at her husband's face, 26 years old, grinning, the whole world in front of him, and she thought about everything those hands had built and fixed and given away and everything they had left behind. And she thought about the promise she had kept in the photograph she had brought home, and the crack that had been replaced with new glass, and the work that was waiting for her in the morning. Outside, the last engine faded. The street went quiet. Margaret Whitmore made her coffee, held a cup in both hands, and looked at the man she had loved for 42 years, and the wings her son had engraved below the gas cap of a motorcycle that was finally completely home. She had been told her whole life in 100 different ways by 100 different systems and situations, and people who had assessed her and found her insufficient. She had been told over and over that people like her did not matter enough to be seen. She had never believed it. Not for one day, not for 1 hour, not for 1 minute standing alone in a parking lot with handcuffs on her wrist and a photograph on the ground and 40 people watching. She had never believed it, and she had been right not to believe it. And the proof of that was not the council vote or the video views or the chief's press conference or the changed policies beginning to take shape in a town that was slowly, genuinely, imperfectly learning to do better. The proof was the wings on Thomas's motorcycle engraved by a son who had learned from his father that the right thing was worth doing even when it cost you. The proof was Maria Gutierrez sleeping better this week than she had in 3 months because someone had finally written her name into the record. The proof was Marcus Webb II, who had given his full name to a journalist because a 68-year-old grandmother from Montana had made him believe it mattered. The proof was a young officer carrying a cracked picture frame as a daily reminder that assumption has a cost and that the cost is always paid by someone else. The proof was Linda Parker sitting 3 rows from the back, finding her way to a microphone. The proof was Caleb sitting across the kitchen table right now, watching his mother the way Thomas used to watch her, with the particular attention of someone who loves you completely and is not embarrassed about it. The proof was the Harley in the driveway, finally home. Margaret took a long sip of her coffee. She set the cup down. She looked at Thomas. "We're not done," she told him. And the thing about Margaret Whitmore, the thing that the parking lot had shown the world and that the world had needed to see, was that she had never been done, not once in 68 years, and she was not about to start now. Some people are quieter than the world expects them to be. That does not make them smaller. It makes them the ones whose stories, when they finally get told, travel farther than anyone thought possible, past the news cycle and the comment sections, in the 11 days of visibility, past the council votes, in the policy changes, in the formal reviews, past every system that ever decided they were insufficient, all the way to the place where real change lives, in the hands of the next person who needs to believe that speaking matters. In the room where the next Margaret Whitmore is standing alone, in the silence before someone decides to stop being quiet, that is where her story lives. And that is exactly where it belongs.